Trees are a natural part of the open woodland type habitat that is best suited to pasture type production in New Zealand. If the types of pasture habitats we had in New Zealand were just left without the disturbance from browsers, they would revert within the next 10 or 20 years back into forest again. So it's the natural characteristic of these kind of lowland agricultural environments is to revert into forest. So working with that natural process is of good use into the design of that farm system and also the healthy function of that farm system. So there's a couple of different kind of agricultural production systems that incorporate trees into them. So it's modelled off an open woodland environment. So when you go into kind of a European type habitat, they've got patches of meadows, they've got patches of forest, and the two types of habitat are kind of dependent upon the impact on that particular land. So how high the disturbances on that land, what are the particular characteristics of that site as far as, is it in a wetland area or is it quite steep in elevation, and how that impacts the browsing of those animals and therefore the regeneration of the forest. So we can be guided by those natural patterns in the design of our own farm systems, particularly with the knowledge we have of how the grazing of pastures on a steeper slope will lead to the detrimental erosion of those slopes and the reduction in the health and productivity of those systems. So we can start to select in our landscape the areas which are most beneficially planted with different types of trees or shrubs or grasses and managed in different ways. So it's trying to replicate that open woodland type habitat. And the incorporation of trees within a pasture-based system is generally referred to as silver pasture. So there's different ways you can do it. It's either quite an open woodland, open pasture system with just the occasional trees planted out through it, and then those trees provide habitat and shade and shelter for the animals and for birds, and they can also provide an alternative form of income. So they could be a logging tree, or they could be a nut tree or a big fruit tree. And if it's a fruit tree, it might even be an alternative fodder for the plants, or it could even be a fodder tree. It could be a willow or a poplar or a tree lucerne that the browsers and grazers can actually eat as an alternative to the pasture grasses and herbs. And then if that integration of trees into the pasture takes a more linear planted approach, it's called alley cropping. So that's when generally you have rows of trees. So that's moving towards a more highly productive in tree system, but still has the pasture integrated in with it. So again, those trees could be a timber, they could be a fodder for the animals, they could be a nut, they could be a fruit, or it could just be some sort of wildlife habitat, or some bee fodder perhaps, or some other tree that has benefit to the natural habitat of that region. But generally, for silver pasture, you're producing a productive tree, and the growth of that tree is actually of economic advantage to the farmer. And it's not only economically viable tree crop, but the integration of that tree crop into the pasture system has benefits to both systems. So the grazers, for example, can help prune and manage the understory of these trees to better concentrate the nutrients available in that system towards the tree growth. And they can also add their own fertility as far as manures into the soil to also help the trees in their growth. And in exchange, the trees can shade and shelter the herbs and grasses, particularly on dry north-facing slopes that would otherwise diminish in productivity quite early in summer as they dry out. The incorporation of trees into that system will extend the productivity of the grasses and herbs that are in that system that will then feed the grazers and feed the grazers for longer into the summer than would be otherwise without trees in that system. So there's a couple of factors that are good to think about with incorporating trees into a system. So one is the shade that they provide, particularly on those north-facing slopes that extend the productivity. The habitat and the shelter they provide for the animals. Normally, grazers and browsers would seek shelter amongst clusters of trees when there's cold winds or there's wind driving rains or any other kind of, or even hot conditions that are stressing the animals. And the provision of that habitat and that shade will actually improve the health and the productivity of the animals. So it's not only increasing the health of the system, it's increasing the productivity of the system. They can also stabilise the soil from erosion, so particularly on steeper slopes which are more prone to erosion, having them planted in trees is going to shade and protect the soil from erosion from the elements and stabilise the soil, and even increase the organic matter into the soil, because the trees themselves will be putting exudates or sugars into the soil as they photosynthesize. So you've got a big tree pumping out lots of sugars into the soil, and those sugars help build up the carbon in the soil. They feed the soil organisms, and in association with the root system that's there, they provide a habitat and a food for the soil organisms, and those soil organisms will then distribute those nutrients into the surrounding pasture systems and increase the health and productivity of those pasture systems as well. So there's a bit of a net gain in productivity with incorporating trees, and that gain in fertility and productivity will spread out into the surrounding pasture systems. They can also absorb excess nutrients, so if there's an fertilizer applied onto the pastures to increase their production, the root zone of the pastures, depending on how tall the pasture is, but the root zone tends to be only 10 centimetres to a metre in depth. So as soon as the water moves past that root zone, the plants can no longer absorb the nutrients that were in those fertilizer. So having a bigger root system of the trees, which might extend for 10-20 metres down into the soil, provides more opportunity to absorb those excess nutrients out of the system before they enter natural systems and can pollute those systems. In a similar way, you can plant out wetlands and streams and rivers as an extra protection against any of the nutrients that are flowing through that landscape and could enter into that system. But you've got to keep in mind that planting out a whole catchment that might be hundreds of thousands of square kilometres in size, and only planting a small strip alongside the river or stream is not going to impact the movement of nutrients within that whole system. So while it's of benefit, it's not the answer to the nutrients flowing through that whole catchment and how you can manage all of those nutrients. Other benefits are they provide a habitat for wildlife. They can even create a corridor between habitats. So particularly if it's along waterways, you might have areas of good habitat higher up in the catchment, and then if that waterway is planted as well, you can connect lowland, wetland areas, for example, that are also important habitat for wildlife, to the areas higher up, which are maybe a native forest, and the riparian planting along the streams helps connect those two habitats together. And that provides a corridor for wildlife to move between those two habitats. And the other ones is really a alternative fodder for the animals and an alternative income. So it's particularly a benefit along fence lines. So if you have a windbreak, for example, which is planted out with trees, it's a benefit along the fence line of that windbreak to plant edible trees that the animals can browse upon as a supplement to the feed that they're getting off the pasture. So you may have a pasture system and a planting in association with maybe a stream, so it might be a riparian planting, or it might be a windbreak, or it might be a cash crop, or a food forest, or whatever it is. But generally you'd have some sort of diversity of trees planted in that. So you'd have your taller canopy trees, and then either smaller trees or shrubs on the edges of that. And then next to the fence line you might incorporate some fodder trees into that, which can hang over the fence line and can be grazed upon by the animals in this system as an alternative to their diet. So you're getting the benefits of your economic nuts or fruits or natural habitat in your windbreak or your silver pasture system, and on the edge of that you can incorporate some fodder trees for the browsers to feed upon.